Okay, let's dive in. Picture this, the Mongolian steppe. It's just vast, incredibly wild. And the wind, the sources describe it as relentless, almost like a spirit.
It sets a powerful scene, doesn't it? Wide open, but also really harsh.
Exactly. And into that world, near the Unknown River, around 1162, a baby is born, Temujin. And the sources mention this striking detail. He's born clutching a blood clot.
Right, which, according to the material we're looking at, the shamans immediately saw as, well, significant.
Yeah.
A sign of destiny, of future rule.
But what hits you straight away is the clash, the supposed destiny versus the actual brutal reality he was born into.
Absolutely. Hunger, constant tribal fighting, exile. That was his world from day one, a really tough start.
And that's the journey we want to unpack in this deep dive, using only the insights from the material you've shared. How does this boy, Temujin, become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler?
It's more than just the battles, isn't it? It's about understanding the man himself, his methods, his impact, based on what these sources tell us.
Yeah, getting to the core insights. Because really, you can't grasp the Khan without understanding Temujin's beginning.
Precisely. That early life is critical.
So let's start right there. The sources paint a picture of real hardship. His father, Yasuge, a chieftain, is poisoned. And Temujin is only, 9 years old?
9. And in that society, losing your father, the leader, wasn't just grief. It was catastrophic for the family standing.
So what happened then?
Well, the sources are clear. Their own clan basically abandoned them, just cast them out. They were left to survive on their own in the wilderness, scavenging for food, roots, enduring these brutal winters, facing starvation.
Just utterly abandoned. It sounds horrific, but the material also highlights his mother, Halun. She sounds like an incredible figure.
Yeah, a pillar of strength. The sources even give us that quote attributed to her. We are not made to break, we are made to endure. Powerful word.
That idea of endurance, it feels like it was hammered into him from the start.
Forged in fire, you could say. And it got worse, didn't it? The sources mention he was actually captured at one point, enslaved by a rival clan.
Yeah, and they mention the physical reality of it, this wooden yoke around his neck, a really stark image.
But here's the thing, his response wasn't just passive suffering. The material says he was quiet, yes, but he was listening, observing, planning his escape.
Even then, that's telling.
It really is. That whole experience, the capture, the yoke, the eventual escape, it seems like it baked in this combination of maybe caution, but also absolute ruthlessness and determination when you've been at rock bottom like that.
It changes you fundamentally. Okay, so he survives. But how does he go from just surviving to actually building power on the steppe? The sources talk about the Undanda, the Blood Brother Alliance. That was crucial.
Absolutely vital in that world. It was about sworn loyalty. And he formed one of these bonds with Jamuka. Your sources say they even shared this dream initially of uniting the tribes.
A shared vision. But then things started to diverge.
They did. And the material points to how Temujin started gathering followers. He wasn't just relying on noble families. He promoted people based on their skill, their loyalty merit, essentially.
Regardless of their birth.
Exactly. The sources specifically mention him elevating guys like blacksmiths, horse herders, people who, traditionally wouldn't have had that kind of influence.
Which must have really shaken things up. How did Jamuka react? He was from a noble background, wasn't he?
It was. And he saw Temujin's approach as undermining the whole social order. Like it was treasonous to the traditional ways.
So that difference in philosophy led to conflict.
A major conflict. They ended up fighting a battle. Jamuka actually won that first round. But then the sources describe this horrifying act. Jamuka executed Temujin's captured generals by boiling them alive.
Boiling them. That's incredibly brutal. What was the message there?
Utter terror and a clear rejection of Temujin and his followers. A warning. It shows the sheer brutality of steppe politics at the time.
You'd think that level of betrayal and defeat might break someone?
But the sources say Temujin came back from it. Maybe not immediately, but he returned stronger, more focused, perhaps even more ruthless himself after seeing that.
So he learns, adapts, keeps going. And this period of fighting, alliances, betrayal, it all leads somewhere big.
It culminates in 1206 at this great assembly, the Kurultai. It's a pivotal moment described in your sources. After years of struggle, consolidating power, defeating rivals, he's finally declared Genghis Khan, universal ruler.
And this wasn't just a fancy title.
No. The sources frame it as the moment the scattered Mongol tribes were truly united. For the first time, they were one nation under his leadership.
Okay, so he's united the tribes largely through force and political maneuvering. But the sources suggest there was more to his rule than just being the strongest warlord. They mentioned the yasa, a legal code.
Yes, and this is a really important insight from the material we have. He wasn't just about conquest, he was about creating order. The Yasa laid down laws for this new nation.
What kind of laws?
Well, the sources detail things like incredibly strict punishments for theft, which makes sense, given the nomadic lifestyle. Also, clear rewards for loyalty again, reflecting his own experiences. Crucially, it outlawed the traditional blood feuds.
Those cycles of revenge killing between clans.
Exactly. You put a stop to that, which must have been huge for stability. And importantly, the Yasa reinforced his principle: promotion based on talent and loyalty, not just who your father was.
So codifying that meritocracy, interesting. And personally, he was quite the warrior too, right? The sources mention his skill on horseback.
Oh, absolutely. Legendary skills.
Yeah.
Riding at full gallop, shooting arrows accurately in any direction. The sources paint him as the epitome of a steppe warrior. And his army was built in that same mold. Tough, resilient, trained from childhood, living rough on basic rations like meat and fermented mare's milk and kumis.
But it wasn't just about being tough, was it? The sources point to strategic innovations.
Definitely. Beyond just brute force, they use things like signal flags for coordinating large armies on the battlefield. Really sophisticated for the time. And then there's the YAM system.
The courier network.
Yeah, this incredibly efficient postal relay system. Riders with fresh horses at stations spread across the empire. Information could travel astonishingly fast, which was a massive strategic advantage.
And they weren't afraid to learn from others.
Not at all. The sources say they quickly adopted siege warfare techniques from the settled peoples they conquered. They learned how to take down fortified cities, which wasn't originally a steppe specialty. Plus, they were masters of psychological warfare.
Using fear as a weapon.
Absolutely. Their reputation often preceded them, deliberately cultivated to demoralize enemies before a battle even started.
So the sources seem to suggest he was more than just a general. He was a master strategist, an innovator, maybe even a master of understanding people.
I think that captures it well. Understanding human behavior, how to motivate through loyalty and rewards, how to control through law and fear. That understanding seems central to how he united the tribes and then led them to conquer.
And conquer they did. The scale described in the sources is just staggering.
Let's talk about the Jin dynasty in China, starting around 1211.
Right. According to the material, the Jin had always sort of looked down on the Mongols, dismissed them as northern barbarians. That seems to have been the spark, or at least a major factor.
And Genghis Khan's response.
Swift and utterly devastating, based on the accounts. Mongol armies just poured into northern China. The sources describe them dismantling the Jin forces, sacking cities, and eventually taking the capital, Zhengdu, what's now Beijing. Walls that seemed impregnable just crumbled.
A powerful statement to the established empires. Then he turns west.
Towards the Khwarezmian Empire.
Yes, a few years later, around 1218. And here, the sources highlight a specific incident, what they call a fatal mistake, by the Khwarezmian Shah. He executed Genghis Khan's trade envoys, his ambassadors.
Which was more than just an insult, right, in Mongol eyes.
It was a massive violation. Ambassadors and envoys were considered sacrosanct under Mongol law and custom, essential for communication and trade. Killing them was seen as an unforgivable act, according to your sources.
So this provoked an even fiercer reaction.
Oh, yes. The vengeance described in the sources is legendary for its scale and brutality. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, major centers of culture and trade were systematically destroyed. The accounts emphasize that this wasn't just random violence, it was deliberate, making examples.
Sending a message, don't mess with Mongol envoys, don't disrupt our trade, don't defy our laws.
Exactly. Protect the roads, protect the messengers, obey the authority. The message was brutally clear.
But then, amidst all this destruction, the sources introduce this counter-narrative almost. The idea of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that seems surprising.
It often is, reading these accounts. Because alongside the conquest, the sources describe Genghis Khan and his successors imposing law and order across this enormous new territory. They actively worked to make trade routes safe.
So after the initial conquest, things actually settled down in some ways.
In many ways, yes. The sources mention invitations to scholars, merchants, artisans from all over to travel freely within the empire. The Silk Road, which had been fragmented and dangerous, suddenly fell under this single imperial umbrella.
Wow, so trade and ideas could flow more easily than before.
Much more easily. The sources describe it like blood flowing through a single body. Unprecedented levels of contact and exchange between East and West were suddenly possible, facilitated by Mongol control and security. It had huge long-term consequences.
It really adds layers to the picture. He's clearly not just a one-dimensional conqueror in these accounts. The sources seem insistent on his complexity.
They really do. They present details that complicate the simple barbarian warlord image. For instance, the respect shown towards women is noted. His daughters held significant power, acting as governors. His mother, Hulin, remained influential, a sort of moral guidepost.
And that recurring theme of loyalty.
Yes, intensely valued. And the flip side, absolute severity towards betrayal. It seems deeply personal, rooted in his own experiences.
There are also these smaller, more personal details mentioned, like him living relatively simply in camp, sharing spoils with his soldiers.
Right, not hoarding wealth in a palace somewhere, initially at least. The sources even mention him engaging in philosophical debates, appreciating poetry, and apparently weeping openly when a close friend died. It rounds out the picture.
How did he see himself in all this? Did the sources give any insight into his own view of his role?
They suggest he didn't see himself as a god, but more as an instrument, a servant of the eternal blue sky, which was the supreme Mongol deity, chosen for a specific, perhaps harsh duty rather than personal glory.
Which connects to that famous quote you find in the material. I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me.
Exactly. It frames his actions, even the most brutal ones, within this larger, almost cosmic sense of purpose or destiny. Whether that was genuine belief or justification, it's how the sources portray his perspective. He's a complex figure. Driven, loyal, ruthless, strategic, maybe even spiritual in his own way.
Let's turn to the end of his life. He died in 1227, the sources say, while campaigning against the Western Shia. But even his death seems shrouded in questions.
It is. The exact cause isn't definitively known, according to the material. Was it an illness? Did he fall from his horse during a hunt? Was there assassination involved? The sources mention these possibilities, but there's no consensus. It remains a mystery.
And the burial itself is legendary for its secrecy.
Absolutely. His body was taken back to Mongolia, but the sources describe incredible efforts to keep the location of his grave a secret. There are stories, maybe legends, that the soldiers involved in the burial were killed and that the landscape was altered to hide it.
And to this day.
To this day, as your material confirms, the location of Genghis Khan's tomb is unknown. One of history's great secrets. Why such secrecy? Maybe to prevent enemies desecrating it. Maybe a desire to return anonymously to the steppe. It adds to the mystique.
What's truly mind-blowing, though, reading these sources, is what happened after his death. The empire didn't just collapse.
Far from it. It actually expanded dramatically under his sons and grandsons, figures like Ogedei, Kublai Khan, Hulagu, Batu. The sources map out this incredible growth.
Reaching where? What was the eventual extent?
Just immense. The largest contiguous land empire ever created, stretching from Korea across Asia to the borders of Poland and Europe, down through Persia and the Middle East to Baghdad, up into Siberia. Just staggering reach.
And his descendants left their own massive marks on history.
Huge marks. Kublai Khan establishing the Yuan dynasty in China. Hulagu's sack of Baghdad, which is often cited as impacting the Islamic Golden Age. Batu Khan and the Golden Horde, terrifying Eastern Europe for centuries. The impact continued long after Genghis himself was gone.
Did the sources say why it eventually broke apart?
Primarily internal divisions, rivalries between different branches of the family, and the sheer difficulty of governing such a vast and diverse territory. Over time, different parts of the empire were also absorbed or assimilated into the local cultures they ruled.
But the legacy, the echoes, as the outline called them, remained.
Absolutely. That east-west connection, the flow of trade, technology, ideas like gunpowder, paper, the compass moving west that was accelerated by the Mongol Empire, languages mixed, cultures interacted, maps were redrawn. The world became, in a sense, more connected because of the empire he founded.
And in Mongolia today, how is he viewed, according to the sources?
He's revered, seen as the founding father of the nation, a figure of immense national pride.
And then there's that startling genetic statistic mentioned in the material.
Yeah, that's always a wild one to think about. Genetic studies estimate that something like 1 in 200 men alive today might be a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan.
That's an incredible biological legacy on top of the historical one.
It really brings home the scale of his impact, doesn't it? It's why, as the sources make clear, his name still resonates so powerfully after 800 years. not just for the conquest, but for fundamentally reshaping interactions across the globe.
So pulling it all together from the material provided for this deep dive, we see this arc. Temujin, the outcast boy, shaped by hardship and betrayal. Then Genghis Khan, the unifier, the innovator, the lawmaker, the conqueror on an unimaginable scale. A figure of profound complexity.
And these sources really give you that direct line, that shortcut to understanding the man, the empire, and why it all still matters, based purely on the information gathered.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on, based on everything we've explored from these sources. Here's a man who builds the largest contiguous land empire in history, institutes laws, connects east and west like never before, yet his own end is a mystery. He vanishes, essentially, back into the steppe, his grave unknown. What does that ultimate vanishing act tell us about legacy, about him, about the nature of power, when you set it against the massive, undeniable mark he left on the world?